And I really, really like Ethan Nelson and the idea of the need to have kind of a fighter spirit today. But then there's also this risk of like fighting for the system. So like if you work really hard, but it's for, say, a corporation, you're like getting up and but you're like working really difficult, but you're actually like supporting the corporation, leading to dehumanization. That's an interesting tension. But then at the same time, the warrior spirit seems really important to get out of bed in the morning and not fall into hopeless nihilism. Also, I definitely resonate with the idea that if you do like creative work like we do where you're not paid for, everyone tells you you're crazy and an idiot, and why would you even do that? And you kind of have to have the fighter spirit for it. And so that seems really important. But I'm really interested, like, what is it, Tennyson, who said something? Because there's also like, as you get older, the warrior metaphor seems inadequate. You're like, I'm just tired and trying to survive. I don't know about being Achilles or something. But then there's, of course, and then it's difficult to talk about like a warrior spirit because it's so Andrew Tate now, right? Like everyone's Andrew Tate or something. But then there's also a form of the warrior that makes me think of Ulysses by Tennyson, where he says something like, frail by time and fate, but strong in will to seek to find and not to yield. You know, that idea that as you get older, the necessity of keeping going seems important. So I'm curious everyone's reactions, like, to what degree is it good to be a fighter today? To what degree is that denying, nihilism? Are you in denial of the truth that fighting is a waste of time because you can't succeed, or all fight is going to be part of the system? I'm very curious about the virtue of fighting, I guess, or putting up a fight, or the virtue of fighting for something. We don't have to talk about that, but I found the discussion yesterday
I think
lovely.
it's a very interesting, thing to think about. I think generally the archetypes are very interesting to think about. Anyway, I personally, we can discuss the Freud and Jung debate and all of that thing, but there's something interesting to look at the world through these archetypical, meanderings in that sense. And at least, as I said yesterday, for me, this question of warrior has something to do with how we inhabit the realm of violence, in many ways. Because most of us, in the realm of violence, I don't mean just fighting somebody physically. The realm of violence happens in many different engagements of our lives. Most of us have this very compulsive relationship with the realm. Most of us, when we find ourselves in that realm, we are always acting with compulsion. We are not being able to deliberately act in that situation, as many of us say, because realm of violence is antagonistic to realm of speech. Hannah Arendt saw that. Many philosophers, even Girard, have written about that how violence sort of destroys speech. Isn't it that when there is violence that is prevalent, you can't have speech, which is why you have to come back into politics at some level for negotiation when you enter into violence, and so on and so forth. So given that reality, how do we sort of inhabit this realm? I think that's something to do with the warrior spirit. Traditionally, historically speaking, even if you look at warriors of idea warriors in the Hindu tradition in India, or you look at in Amerindian traditions, it has always been an ability to hold truth without speech, which is an enigma anyway, because they have to commit to truth even when speech is absent, which is very which is not to say that they have truth in this idea of thought and speech, and they're not philosophers in that sense, but they have to commit to that to some degree, even within those contours of violence where speech is not accessible. How does one do that? What are the contours of that? I think it's an interesting question to think about, I guess.
The idea of holding truth without speech, oh, that's good, as something about the warrior spirit. And it's very interesting, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber. So, for example, when Pontius Pilate asked Jesus, "Who are you?" and he's silent, is that a warrior? Is he fighting the temptation to speak, or is it passive? Obviously we have Achilles, but the funny thing about Achilles is the whole kind of joke of that story is that, Hector can be a good ruler, but precisely because he has what it has to be a good ruler, he has no chance to get Achilles. So in that example, the superior warrior talent comes at the expense of being a good ruler, right? But there's also for example, let's take Julie Resch. If you fight the therapeutic temptation, like if you say, no, I'm not going to pretend like therapy is going to deal anything, I'm going to sit with the negativity. Is that being a warrior, or is that being a nihilist? Like, what does it mean to fight for something? Because from one perspective, that's giving up to fight the therapeutic. But from another perspective, it's fighting the temptation of the therapeutic. So it's so interesting how it does seem to be like contextual, right? Like in art, like today, arguably, if you fight to, like Michelle and I, we live on a farm, wasting our potential, not part of a career or anything like that. And for a lot of people, they'd be like, oh, you're wasting your life. And you have to fight people who say stuff like that. But 50 years ago, you had to fight the fear of not leaving the farm, right? And so it's interesting how it kind of flips. And I'm really interested. I guess I really like this idea of fighting having something to do with holding a truth where speech fails, because you can't explain yourself if you do some of these things. Like you can't explain why you're doing it, but you have to know that what you're doing, you just have to show it. And that seems to be less contextual there. I just really like that. I'm going to give it to Andrew Luber, then back to Chetan. And we're traveling across the United States of America with Tyler Murphy today, which is really delightful. So Mr. Andrew Luber, you look... Oh, we're traveling. No, it's snowing. What? It is snowing? Where are you? It is... Tyler, where are you?
Right outside my house.
Wow. You're going to freeze to death. It's 80 in Virginia. Don't die.
Wow.
Yeah, it's like 80 today. So it's not 80 at your house, and it's snowing in October. Well, Tyler, good to have you, sir. Thank you for joining us. It's always good to see you. Andrew Luber, I like your glasses, and then I'll give it to Chetan. Mr. Luber.
Thank you. I'm getting more blind as I get older. I really like Chetan's brought up this notion of violence, in a few net conversations. I think it's a really fruitful thing to think about. And what does it mean to, work with violence in a certain sense? And then I'm reading Lacan right now, and it's just making me think about the drive. And just specifically, I'm at this part where he's talking about the loop shape of the drive, and that it basically, the drive gets, ignited, if you will, by this erogenous zone. I don't know if I'm saying the word correctly, but and then I also want to get to that not saying things correctly, this pre-language thing, but one thing at a time. I just wonder if that zone for Lacan, if that is considered him thinking about this violent zone, when violence occurs, it's a signifier for the drive, essentially. I wonder if what's the relation between that zone, the E zone, just because I don't know if I'm saying it right, and violence. So I just wanted to throw that question out. And then I was actually talking to Alex this morning about we kind of touched on it on the last net conversation about how I can say something completely incorrect, and yet the entire meaning still seeps through. What is going on? Because the value isn't in me saying it correctly. So basically, I'm going through my text message with him, and we came up with some good questions, like what is the baseline of getting the sentiment across? What is the actual baseline, in a conversation, in just I need to give someone directions, and let's say I have really broke English, how the hell does that happen? What is it, what needs to be said, and what is needed for the expression itself? And those type of questions we were flirting with this morning. And basically my thoughts are, where my thoughts are with it is just that it has to do, Daniel, you were saying that it has to do with something not contextual, but I think you were talking about something a little different than what I'm talking about. So I'm thinking it has to do with understanding context, but it's the baseline has to be something where it's pre-language, prior to reflection. It has to be in the experience, and there being a sense of in the experience where you're not able to reflect while in the experience, because if you're reflecting in the experience, you're not necessarily in the experience in the way that I'm talking about it. So you have to be in the experience insofar as the way you utter and express yourself conforms to the experiential world in which you're embedded in. And like the actual, and when I say utter, what I really mean is just at its core movement, like the movement of what being is doing in the experience. There's a certain level of conformity and a certain level of translucence in that conformity where you're able to see the conformity in a way that you don't need to think about the conformity because you're acting in concert with the conformity. So like it has to do with something. And the whole tricky part, and we've talked about this on the net a few times, the whole tricky part about this is like to talk about that is essentially reflecting on the experience, which is essentially a different dimension of experiencing than the dimension I'm talking about. So it's very interesting to think about what that baseline is and where that baseline goes. I think Lacan was just talking about passive, active, and reflexive voice. And those are, to me, different ways of accessing that dimension without necessarily using like descriptive language, phenomenological language. Like it is phenomenological in a certain sense, but really the way he's talking about it, it's like pointing to the movement in the experience and not necessarily the description of the experience. So that's how I see it as a little different than the phenomenology of it. Yeah, I guess one more thing I had, and this has to do with everything that I was saying. I had an incredible experience with a group of friends last weekend where we saw this concert called a live band called Stavro. I'll send the band in the name. It was like jazz music meets archaic primordial music. It was like there's no words. It was like almost like Jewish, like it was like very, very crazy. And there was like a moment, I mean, I cried out of pure ecstasy and love because I just felt so home with who I was with. And that feeling of homeness, there was a certain feeling of conformity in the experience where it was just like, I feel like I am, like, it felt like I was about to have so much to say, but I couldn't say it. It was like, I'm about to say something, but I can't even say it because it's that I'm so in the experience. And then I feel like I'm conforming in it, that like the reflection of the experience is on the precipice. And I'm like almost there to like almost reflect about it, but I'm not there. It's like, I can't get there. I'm in it still. And it just was so beautiful, like flickering on that liminal space that I just started crying, that it was like, oh my God, this is beautiful. This is truly beautiful. So yeah, I just wanted to share that little story, and sorry for talking so much. I'll pass it off to Daniel.
Please do not be sorry to talk. And Michelle, good to see you. And Chetan, I'll give it to Chetan, then Tyler. And I promise you would have a similar liminal experience if you were on the porch listening to me play harmonica. It has a similar transcendent quality if it's in the key of D. Not any other key, but D's the secret, really. There's a bunch of things that come to mind. First off, I'm very, very interested in the failure to speech, because obviously in psychoanalysis, the failure to say has a lot to do, and there's a notion of speech as violence. And in that context, it's like Cadell was saying in the last Lacan lecture, like, if I am maintaining a relationship with you because I'm not saying the thing that we all know, which is that, I smoke way too much and I'm giving you lung cancer, then the violence is to destroy the relationship by saying the thing that everyone knows. And that's something in psychoanalysis where you don't really, the analyst doesn't need to so much say the problem because everyone already knows the problem. It's the approaching how to articulate it in a manner to where the violence of it is not overwhelming. It comes, but it's more it's a complicated thing. I'm not a psychoanalyst. But what's very interesting too is the failures to speak that come out when you don't say it and yet the other person gets it. I'm glad Michelle is here because we talk about how twins are capable of telepathy. And it's fascinating where twins just get what the other person is saying, even though they don't say it. How is that possible? It shows that speech is indivisible from the relation. Like Michelle will mention how like things to her, I'll be like, Michelle, I didn't interpret what you said that way. And it's like, what do you mean? Because your entire life you grew up with telepathy and then you encounter someone who doesn't have telepathy. And I'm not saying telepathy is a bad thing, but it's a revelation that speech isn't what we think it is. It's not merely the words that are spoken. There's a certain sort of givenness of relation or sharedness or context that's actually filling in that you don't see if you're just looking at the words. it seems like that's all happening is the words, but it's in the breaks of the word that it unveils there's an entire relation structure that's actually filling in the language. And these breaks in language seem really, really important. And then it makes me think about the difference between having nothing to say and failing to say. Like when you're speaking with friends and you fail to say something and they still get it, that unveils the revelation, that unveils something about the nature of the human subject. Likewise, if when Jesus is talking to Pontius, I just use that example, it's not that he is afraid to say, he just knows that he'll fail to say it and it can't be said because you just have to get it. That seems very different than a kind of fear-based thing, which unveils that not everything can just be communicated, that the human experience is something more than just the direct information. And like you're saying, it's like, and then the question would be, in order to have something to fail to say, it seems like you have to fight to be able to be the kind of subject who has something to fail to say and to defend the spaces in which you fail to say. So it's like, it's very close to having nothing to say or avoidance, because you could like, and the whole psychoanalysis saying is like, you're not saying the thing that needs to be said. So that's avoidance. But that not saying seems different than failing to say. And I wonder if the warrior spirit in this way that we're describing, it's somehow tied to fighting to do the thing so that you can fail to say or trace out the contours of what's not being said in the failure, and then to defend that space, that liminal space of beauty. It's almost like there's a conditioning that has to occur to keep those in mind. I'm not sure, but I appreciate what you said. And like I said, you come down and we'll do harmonica on the porch anytime. Let me give it to Chetan and then Tyler Murphy. And Michelle, you should know that Tyler is gradually being buried under snow. He's in his car. He probably has a few more hours. But just, he's going to be, I know, it's snowing. It's 80 in Virginia. So Tyler is gradually being buried alive. Chetan, please, and then Mr. Murphy.
When you're talking about question of, violence and I remember Zizek's one statement that in what way Gandhi was more violent than Hitler. And that's the good way to think about this problem in that sense. Because with all of Gandhi's flaws, Indians, I'm sort of born and brought up with Gandhi in many ways, because you're hearing about him since childhood, and with all of his flaws, he had one capacity that he could hold himself in confrontation with great violence many times. Bad day in prison, Britishers, all of that given. He had this capacity that he was a political man. I don't think, we try and create a great image of him being, although he's written this great book called My Experiments with Truth in that sense. But he had this capacity to hold himself in the face of violence. How do we understand that kind of a capacity of a man? That he wouldn't let go of his political self, even when he's facing that great time, he's done some amazing things to be able to show that. The people forget that when India was getting independent, he wasn't enjoying himself somewhere. He was standing in the midst of riots in Delhi. The riots happening, and he reached there. He sort of took a fast. He said, "I'll not allow these riots to take place," so on and so forth. How do we even in death? Most people don't realize that he knew he's about to die. There were 5 attempts on his life before that. And he knew that somebody was going to come and going to kill him. And he said, "I will not change my routine because my death is important for this moment to get into the consecrated in that sense." If that is the way India can, and India did gain some peaceful years because of, they were able to discredit the right wing forces for a long time. How do we understand that kind of a way to hold yourself in the face of? And I think we would have many other examples, I'm sure. I just think one just came to my mind immediately. And that's somewhere it signifies this point of whether the stories are true or not. That is also immaterial. I'm just saying that there's something about this narrative about the man that they give you a sense of what being a warrior means in that sense. I think that's first. Second, I'll just sort of maybe quickly wrap it up. But second is, how do we understand this realm of violence? What is this realm all about? Benjamin has a great paper called Critique of Violence. I think we all should read it, in our own ways. But all of it, Benjamin sort of says that violence exists in the realm of means. There is something within means and ends that is a discordant over there. That your means and end never completely overlap. And violence is always in the realm of means, in that sense that when it doesn't matter what means you're able to take to get to your end, you'll get to the realm of violence. How do we think through that structure? I'm not sure. I'm just opening it as a question.
That's a wonderful question. I've not read that by Walter Benjamin. I'll have to give it a look. And Mr. Samuel Barnes, good to see you, sir. I'll pass it on to Tyler Murphy before he's buried alive in snow. And I'm extremely interested on that idea of like, what is the right way to describe the spirit that's willing to, like you're saying with Gandhi, willing to face their potential death or to defend that space of failing to say in the way that like Andrew Luber was describing. It's very interesting because it seems like it's a kind of fighting. And yet it's a kind of fighting that also has to fight the awareness that it may not be seen as fighting. Like it has a kind of existential level, right? It could look like you're a fool. You're an idiot. You should kill these people that are trying to kill you as opposed to put yourself in danger. And it's interesting to think that there's a fight in the fighting against the need to be seen as a fighter, almost, you could say, which is quite curious. That seems to be necessary for this. I'm also quite taken by what is this realm of violence? It seems like it's a defense of the means, like something that is keeping you from or trying to pull you from. Like when you have a certain way of life you're defending, people want you to live according to a different means. You're like, well, this is the way I'm going to take care of a family. No, come to these other means. These are a better way to do it. And they're critiquing you. And it's interesting that violence is like pulling you onto different paths, pulling you onto different ways. And that would almost then be like, yeah, because some people will accuse you of not being a fighter. It's like, oh, you're just defending this way of life. You're not joining a careerism. You're not doing a business. That means you're laying down. You're not fighting. You're not striving. So you have to just know that that's not true. So it's almost like fighting the need to be seen as a fighter as being another level of difficulty, and then fighting to defend these spaces or to honor or to stay in these spaces of something being failed to say or failed to fully experience. It seems like it requires a lot of conditioning. The realm of that, that's very interesting. Let me give it to Tyler Murphy before he's buried alive, and then Mr. Andrew Luber. Mr. Tyler Murphy, please.
Yeah, so I love everything. I love pondering, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to, say, be a warrior? What does it mean to be like a Christian these days? And like, I love the idea of seeking justice and loving mercy, walking humbly with God, setting the captives free, these kinds of things. I've also become disillusioned with the version of Jesus that I inherited. There was a book written by Kristen Dumais called Jesus and John Wayne. Did any of you guys ever read that or hear about that? Yeah, and all the stuff with Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, that kind of stuff. When I encountered that maybe 2 or 3 years ago, that knocked me out of the kind of fundamentalist Christianity that I was in. And it really caused me to, to think back, especially on like when Pilate says, before, behold the man, and there standing is who he gestures to Jesus, and it's this man beaten with a crown of thorns on his head. And, Kristen Dumais talks about how both genders look to the same person, not for what it means to be a man, not for what it means to be a woman, but for what it means to be fully human. The other thing that I love too is that, like, I feel like, I was just telling my roommate this morning, that in order to follow some of those things, like setting the captives free, I actually feel like Lacan and Freud and psychoanalytic theory is needed to be able to effectively bring that about. One of my favorite things recently in reading, I'm reading, Mari Rudy, Singularity of Being, and also Jameson Webster. They both are talking about how psychoanalytic psychoanalysis, one of the hopes, the goals, is that it would give the analysand back their desire, that it would free them, that you would come to know to which signifier, which master signifier the subject is subjected, and hopefully break it out of this tendency to give up on the idiosyncratic singularity of our desire, and that basically the superego punishes us with guilt. We experience guilt when we've given ground relative to our desire. So I guess I feel like, on one hand, the warrior crap that I grew up with, I absolutely hate. And on the other hand, I still affirm this idea of seeking justice, loving mercy, setting the captives free. But it's this odd way of, in order to actually do that, I feel like I need psychoanalytic theory. I need to be someone who doesn't give ground relative to my desire, but that very much does, like Daniel and Michelle, like you guys are saying, it makes you anathema to the people around you, and that's a struggle too. So we need communities that are encouraging us to remain faithful to the singularity of our desire, and also helping to teach us, how do we even come to know what the singularity of our desire is? Where do we look for that kind of a thing? Yeah, that's all.
That was magnificent. And are you saying that John Wayne isn't Jesus? Because you said "and Jesus." I was confused for a minute there. So no, I remember all of that.
To many of my friends, he is equivalent.
Yeah, it's like
it drives me nuts. But
you're kind of like, why does your picture of Jesus on the cross have a cowboy hat? I don't understand. I don't think that doesn't work with the timeline. Oh gosh. I feel exactly the same way that you just described, this tension between defending, like, say, masculine virtue, but not some people say toxic masculinity. The problem is everything that's toxic is virtuous, so then everything's screwed up. And then it's like, this is a really difficult thing because I also really like this idea of psychoanalysis having something to do with freedom. I completely agree that you needed to free people. It's almost like you have to master your master. Like, own your signifier. Like, how do you master your master per se? You're going to have a master, but how do you be masterful in the master and master it like an instrument in a way? It's kind of interesting, as opposed to having some kind of pathological relationship to it, because there's also how do you be free from your freedom? If you have freedom, you're psychologically overwhelmed. Well, how do you be free from that? It's all these contradictions that you have to master to set the captive free, basically. That I feel the same way. It's like setting the captive free looks like contradiction, like getting good at maintaining certain contradictions. I think also with our own if I think about children, I don't personally go, how do I make Haven a man or something? I go, how do I create an environment that incubates intrinsic motivation or something, right? And he has his own interests, and how do I guess I focus on, how do we create courage? I guess I'm interested, because I'd be curious how people respond to this. Let me give it to Mr. Luber. I guess I've always found masculinity is not a useful phrase, because what does it mean? Okay, I know we need courage. I know we need perseverance. I know we need kindness. But I almost sometimes wonder if just focusing on individual virtues is almost and out of that comes virtuous masculinity, virtuous femininity. This is a practical question, actually. So I'm curious what people think. How do you honor something like masculinity? And of course, this applies to femininity just as well. How do you honor that without being stupid? In this kind of stupid way you're talking with the John Wayne and Christ. And then I think it does suggest too that what it means to be a fighter has something to do with learning contradiction or navigating these paradoxes or psychoanalysis. And that's really interesting to me. Let me pass it to Mr. Luber and then Chetan. And you're beautiful. So when you're buried alive, we'll still be here for you. We'll come and get you out. I'll reach into the screen, Tyler Murphy, and I'll get you. So it's no problem. So Dimitri, good to see you. Tyler Murphy slowly being buried alive under snow. So I'll give it to Andrew Luber and then Chetan. Andrew Luber, please.
I think it's a very good question for me, when people focus on particulars, or in this case, virtues, they're focusing on behaviors that aren't, their behaviors isolated in themselves, and they're not understood in terms of it being in conjunction with the always already present context that the behaviors emerge out of in a certain sense. So not basically theme. Like if you're not looking at how the behaviors emerge and how you fundamentally understand the behaviors, then I think what will happen is it's more likely that you will misunderstand the behaviors ultimately. And I think psychoanalysis does a good job of trying to capture the emergence of behaviors without putting it in a box where it just simply is a behavior in itself. Yeah, honestly, I kind of want to hear you just phrase the question again, because I thought it was actually a really important question. Because what you're essentially getting at in my mind with that question, at least the sentiment that I got, is like, why is there bad war? Why is there bad, like everyone at a certain point doesn't get along, but like the question that like you brought up before is like, what's the best way to not get along? So what you're getting at is how people just look at certain concepts on its surface and not look at the movement, the human conditional movement that works in concert with these concepts. Like people are like, stop war, like going on with the Middle East, stop war. And it's like, are you like, do you know anything about human history? Like history itself is war, is conflict. It wouldn't be history. There wouldn't be history if there wasn't that. Like we are conflict. So like there is no such thing as getting rid of violence, getting rid of these tensions. So I think that, I mean, that's what you're really getting at with your sentiment to me, is like, how do you work best with these tensions and not look at these tensions in a rudimentary way where they essentially dominate your life instead of you dominating it. And then what Tyler was saying, a description of the signifier of desire. So to me, the description of the signifier of desire is theme. And what I mean by that is, so like, and I could be wrong about this, I'm literally in the midst of reading like what the drive is really with Lacan. So to me, the drive just talks about how it moves, how the desire moves. For me, theme describes the movement. Not how it moves, but describes the movement from a phenomenological perspective. So it's not. So to me, when you ask the question of like the description of the signifier, that to me isn't psychoanalysis anymore. That's storytelling. When you're trying to describe how the desire unfolds, you're essentially embedding it at desire in a story to understand how the drive moves. And then when you say how the drive moves, and then it swings back into that psychoanalytical realm. So that's a very raw thought. I could be totally wrong about that. But I'm just personally in the midst of trying to discern the difference between storytelling and what psychoanalysis is, and like where they are placed in the existential map of understanding, so to speak. Anyone could take the floor.
Please tell me when your mom called and you were like, hey mom, I'm busy right now. I'm trying to fit psychoanalysis, storytelling, and theme in the existential map. Please tell me that's what she says. Oh, sorry, son. I'll call later. Please tell me you told her that, because that's amazing. I'll pass it to Chetan. I really like this idea of what's the best way not to get along, because I feel basically what we've done is we've told the story of everyone's the same, so we do get along. That's been kind of the multiculturalism stuff where difference is not deep. That belonging, again, we'll talk about. That's been a mess. That doesn't work because people are different. Or you kind of say because humans do get along. They don't fight over things that matter. They're all nice. No, that's not the case. But you see, if you ask a question, or you can just say, well, they don't get along, so don't even try. Like, all of those are kind of stories you tell that doesn't make you have to do, dare I say, the work. But if you ask the question of what's the best way to not get along, that's work. That's going to encounter the real. You're going to have to acknowledge the difference by definition because you're not getting along. And then it's also, it's a lovely question because it mixes redemption and fight, right? Because it's like, there's going to be difference, there's going to be conflict, but how do we redeem that? Like, how do we come out of that? How do we have cross with resurrection? Because the strategies of denying difference has been tempting, and we've let the market via bourgeoisie virtues and all of that different, the neoliberalism as a phrase that's hard to use because it means a million things to a million people. That strategy has been to make everyone the same in markets, so we get along through market forces that has unintentional consequences, because markets can't replace culture, like we said in a previous net conversation, without a lot of unintentional consequences. And it's also interesting to think of what does politics look like as the best way to not get along. But I'll pass that on to Chetan. I just really like that wording. But Chetan, please.
I think this question of, and I didn't sort of got into it last time precisely because I was thinking, this question of psychoanalysis and violence is extremely interesting. I've been writing a book on violence for quite some time. I started doing my research on violence a few years back, and I started working on a book, and I've never sort of brought it out because I don't know how to publish it at some level, but also because somewhere when I started reading about psychoanalysis, I realized that psychoanalysis is a form of engagement where speech is present. If you think about it, psychoanalysis is primarily a space where speech directs, in that sense. Otherwise, what Lacan would have an argument is that otherwise you enter into this direct confrontation with the real, which has no meaning in Lacan. The real is traumatic, real is horror, and so on and so forth. Also, we also know that there is a certain aggression built in structure of ego. Lacan sort of saw it in his, if you look at Mirror Stage, Aggressivity of, and so on and so forth, his essays, there is a certain aggression built in the structure of ego itself. There's no getting out of it. And I think Andrew had a great point when he sort of thought through this question with relationship to drive and desire. That while it becomes much more difficult to hold your desire in violence. In speech, you can hold an object. Really, the desire has an object. Drives circulate the object, isn't it? That drives are, in some senses, autoerotic, polymorphous movements, which have to be brought into some kind of unity through certain work in psychoanalytic. So it is much more easier to hold drives in the face of violence. In many senses. That is what we when we talk about survival instincts, when we talk about necessity, we are essentially talking about these polymorphous drive-based tendencies taking over, and even this idea of survival instinct. The word instinct is used in a very interesting way over there. It's actually not this concrete instinct in us. It is again something which has this very drive kind of structure built into it when we talk about survival instinct. Because again, it's not like you can hold an object within that. What is at stake in thinking about drives in this manner? And just to sort of maybe add to a point, drives are not just this. There is an added dimension of drive that again that gets visible in desire, and there's a late work of Zizek's new book and those kind of thinking, and just sort of making a simple opposition over here. But a simple opposition does show us something to be happening at this level. That desire itself, can own has this very frictional relationship with violence in some senses. If you think about it, when you enter into the realm of violence, can you hold your desires? Will your desire exist in that space? And I think it's a kind of question we need to maybe work through.
That's fascinating, and Dimitri, your background is great, and I look forward to your talk with Matthew. I saw that came up. He's great. He's wonderful. So a few things. One, I'm really taken by that kind of notion that it's almost like easier and correct me if I'm wrong, it's easier to have drive when faced with violence. Like it's easier, like, oh, if there's a kind of violence, and maybe a reason why, you know, Christians turn Jesus into John Wayne is it's easier to get people to have a drive to be Christian if Jesus is fighting evil or he's John Wayne or something, right? So it's almost like there's a temptation to, well, that would be us versus them, Smith and different, right? Like, can you create structure? And I am so happy to know that you have a book project, T10. Oh my goodness, I am looking forward to that. Oh my goodness. Oh, that's gonna be great. But it's like it's almost like we use violence as motivation then, right? Like we're using violation to get us moving, to get us to do something. But the trick then, because I guess if drive doesn't have violence and it fails, then the only thing to motivate you is desire. And it would almost be then like freedom in the way that Tyler Murphy was, you got to use psychoanalysis to free freedom, or to be freed from necessity. To master your master would be to be able to free desire from drive, which is tempted by violence, which then would require maybe then standing in that space of the fail to say. Like now the question is the following: when Andrew Luber is talking about the liminal space at the concert, and you're like facing this failure, you can't even speak. Is that violence? Is that a moment where you're being driven by a violence against your ability to speak? Or is that where your desire is actually kind of taking over because you have this beatific vision or you're beyond yourself? So there's an interesting question at that liminal experience. Is that drive motivated as violence or by a violence against your ability to speak? Or is it desire, and I almost want to say in a Dante sense, with the wings failing the lofty fantasy before the wheel that turns the other wheel? I'm curious about that. And then if Jesus is refusing to speak to Pontius Pilate, or if Gandhi is refusing to give in to violence, is that drive or desire? Is that a desire for peace, or is that a drive that's arising faced with the violence? I'm speaking live, but I'm curious. Let me pass it to...
Well, I love this idea of, so yeah, I've been really interested in how do we come to know the idiosyncratic call of our character, the singularity of being, the truth of our desire, actually, is I guess how Lacan puts it. And that basically that truth of that desire has been overcoded by some other kind of master signifier, some other givens that we've been subjected to. I love the idea that psychoanalysis, when you're in analysis, is trying to help you come to understand to what master signifier you as a subject are subjected to. But then, okay, so maybe you start to unpack that. Then it still remains, what else is going to be in that ego ideal spot. So I think of the ego ideal and the master signifier as structurally kind of, we're talking about the same thing. It's just different words for talking about that. And then how do you get your ego ideal to be the truth, the specificity of your idiosyncratic desire? And I think we come to catch glimpses of that idiosyncratic desire through things like slips of the tongue, through things like experiences of the gaze. So I think that the gaze is a really interesting one that maybe would speak to what you were bringing up, Daniel, in talking about Andrew's, these moments basically of sublimity, of sublime encounter, where you're in a concert setting, or there's a movie that you've just watched and it somehow, oh my God, it's like it sees you before you see it. And there's a really good article that Michael Downs wrote on what's that Korean show, where the games, it's like Hunger Games, but it's not. I'm not hearing.
Squid Games? We talking Squid Games?
Squid Games. Yeah, he uses that to talk about different things in psychoanalysis. But in that article, he does a really good job of describing the gaze, and he talks about how he's he experiences it when he's walking through his neighborhood down in Raytown, Missouri, in the fall, and just as the evening is just as the day is changing into night, just at evening, it's as if he feels as though he's transported back to this time in the 80s that he's nostalgic for. And he says, it's the experience of the gaze because I feel as though I'm being seen by something external to me, that it's from the dark, shadowy spots within his phenomenological field during those moments that he feels as though he's seen. So my point, I guess, is that the gaze is another way of coming to understand the idiosyncratic desire of an individual, just as slips of the tongue, dreams, I don't know what else, but yeah.
I think
And that sorry, and just that as we are able to more closely identify with our singular desire, basically I'm arguing that we become more courageous individuals, and that we're freed from the societal demands that often end up being super egoic, that that we're all dealing with these days.
I'm really taken by that point on gaze and speech, because it's almost like someone can look at you and make you mad, like your instincts or drive takes over. Like, what are you looking at? But then there's also the gaze of recognition. Oh, they're looking at me. And it's interesting that the same gaze, in one sense, the Saudian gaze, that can lead to a violent, can lead to a backlash. But then another way, the gaze is recognition. And it's funny how one's orientation to the gaze transforms if it's heaven or hell, right? Like if you love God, God is heaven. If you hate God, God is hell, kind of thing. And it's interesting that the gaze, well, and it also makes me think, Cadell was saying in the last lecture how one of the reasons people like animals is because you can't encounter the real from animals. They can't speak to you, right? They can't say the thing and bring out the real. Well, likewise, an animal can't gaze at you with the Saudian gaze, right? You don't have to worry about some sort of meaning in the gaze that would bring out the real or run some kind of risk. So, and it's interesting because we can go outside and take walks and love nature and be all about nature, precisely because we then can get what we need relationally that won't require us to tell our spouse that they they ignore us and don't take advantage of us, right? So that they take advantage of us. So you're avoiding encountering the real by going to other outlets, and animals and nature and things can do that. And it's interesting because it's almost like, and then I'll give it to Luber and Dimitri, it's almost like in the gaze or the speech act, it's almost like a Schrodinger's, will it be a responsive desire or will it be a responsive drive because you feel like you've been violated? It's like open, and we rather not deal with that risk. So we'll just avoid people. Like we rather not take the risk of the gaze turning out to blow up, in a bad way, a hellish way versus a heavenly. So we'll just avoid the gaze. Well, then it would, of course, take what? Courage. It would require courage to step into the gaze or to step into the speech act. But that would also speak, like I've spoken with Owen, like that's why the lack of thymos today is so dire, because you can have all the comfort in relationships and, neoliberal advantages, but if you don't have any sort of training in the thymos or the courage, then people will avoid the gaze. And modern capitalism, I do think, increasingly looks like Japan. Now, I have to make that argument. I think Japan is where Westernization goes without religion over long enough. Now, I've spoken with Daniel Zaruba about that in different things, but because the gaze is just too difficult. The speech act is too difficult unless you've got that courage. So I think those go together. And then that would speak to the warrior spirit, the courage spirit in the way. But let me give it to Andrew Luber and then Dimitri. Mr. Luber, please.
So I think, thinking about me going to that concert and just I'm thinking about the moment I started crying, what actually brought that on, because it was literally not in my control. It was literally I'm just hugging my friends, I just start crying, I'm kissing them on the cheek, thank you, I'm just very, very grateful in an ecstasy way, even though I wasn't on ecstasy. I think when the reason why, from The problem is when we use language like desire or just language in general, it's always like I've pointed out in the reflection of, so it's always like after me crying. So it makes me think that the moment the crying emerged was because there was actually an absence of violence from a phenomenological point of view. Like there was a lack of tension, maybe not in actuality, but just from my own orientation. And it just, the second I realized gratitude, I was already past that emerging moment of what caused me to cry. So and it just brings me back to this, like, okay, like the emerging cry to me is like that storytelling. Like you're just you're just responding to something that you're embedded in, and then you are expressing in a way that you're not conscious of what you're actually expressing in a certain sense. It's just unfolding, it's just happening. And then everything, the actual reflection of it, it's to me, it just seems like psychoanalysis. That's what psychoanalysis is for, is realizing the reflection and deciphering, that reflection or whatever. I just wonder if when evil is committed, when evil happens, it seems to me that there's almost like an absence of violence. Like when they talk about like World War II and like I forget the trials, Nuremberg trials in 1961 or something like that. It wasn't like the guy was thinking too much, It seemed there was almost like he was just in this automation, like to kind of get back to last week's net. Like there was this automation that was happening, and like through that automation, evil emerged. So it's like it's just funny that the absence of violence might call for something beautiful, but at the same time, it also calls for something completely evil. And I think that gives credence to the whole God is good or bad, depending on how you look at it. So the question becomes, how do you enter the absence of violence in a way in which you see the good and not the evil, in which the good is not that you see, but that the good is what emerges after the absence versus the evil, because it seems like the qualifications of both are the same, like literally the same. But yeah, I'll pass off. I have to hop off for 1 second, and then I'll be right back.
But I'm about to play my harmonica and bring you to tears, Andrew. No, take your time, sir, because no doubt you'll be kissing me on the cheek next time when I play the harmonica for you. It's going to be great. I'm going to pass it to Dimitri. It's very interesting because the point you just made does make me think of this interesting issue that it's like Ebert will say with excess, and then it reaches saturation point and it vanishes. It's like if it's like pure evil, then there's no evil, right? Because it's like an excess of it and it vanishes, and you see that in the banality of evil. Eichmann in Jerusalem. And Ethan Nelson, good to see you. We've been talking about warrior spirits and what it means to be a warrior and realm of violence and all sorts of fun things. So good to see you, my friend. And I'm also very taken. So a question I have, and then I'll pass it to Dimitri and Chetan, is the realm of violence the realm of like determinations, like determination, like where something is being determined? Like if someone comes along and speaks to you, you have no control over what they're going to say. But once they say to you, you're forced to live in a world because it's now determined. It's in the realm of determination, to use Hegelian language, where you have to respond to it. Like if you come along and say, hey, Dan, you want to go to the movies? And I don't, crap. Like now I have to like I could piss you off by saying I don't want to go. I could go along. It's like the violence is this feeling of I'm being determined. Like I'm being put in a situation I now have to respond to. And then the warrior spirit would be like the correct, like the knowledge, the wisdom of serpents, the knowledge of how to discern the correct way to respond to that determination you did not want to have yourself in without you having a kind of pathological response to it. Maybe it's like the realm of violence is pending determination. It's almost like it's like everyone's talking about with that new Spadlasky book or whatever on free will or something. It's like it feels like it's almost like violence is actually determinism in the sense of, well, more like determination in the Hegelian sense, like you're being determined, or you find yourself, like one of the reasons you have to indeed have some sort of relation to violence or fighting is because you just find yourself alive. You just find yourself thrown into the world having to respond to it. And what are you going to do? Are you just going to get wiped away? Or are you going to like, do the thing you believe in? Are you going to like just let people push you along? So you find yourself in determination. You just find yourself with drives and desire. What are you going to do about it? And it's almost like that finding yourself dealing with determination requires a response. And that then is, I wonder if there's something about violence and determination, but I'll pass it to Dimitri and then Chetan. Dimitri, it is good to see you. I hope you are doing well today.
Yeah, good to see you all. First, I will respond to Tyler Murphy. I think the point he's making about the gaze is very interesting. Yet he said the ego ideal and the master signifier are basically the same, and I don't think that's the case. To oversimplify it for the sake of explanation, ideal ego is basically when you look yourself in a mirror and you are narcissistically enjoying that image. The ego ideal is not imaginary, it's symbolic. So the ego ideal is the place from which you would like to be seen from the vantage point of other people, small others, ultimately the big other, of course. And the master signifier instead is what we perhaps could designate as an exception of meaning. In other words, like the phallus that constitutes meaning, but is itself not part of the chain of signifiers which constitute that knowledge. So this could be God, this could be the nation state. If you're a nationalist, could be communism if you're a leftist. So this is, it's very different ego ideal from master signifier. Of course, we're never seen from that place from which we want to be seen. And besides this, there's also the issue at play, which is the mask. So there is a way in which there's a truth of desire, and that truth can be brought out through full speech in psychoanalytical therapy, for example. But it's not that this is a true essence that's concealed by another layer of super egoic falsity. Like, in the sense, there is nothing but the super egoically infused falsity, that we must go along with, as in mimesis. That's also how we learn things, by mimicking, basically, by this identificatory process. So in that sense, all that we have is masks. Yet what psychoanalysis proposes, in my reading, is the possibility of subjective destitution. So that is for you to go into a process where you can fundamentally change your relationship to drive or desire. Now, it's the question, what is drive and what is desire? Chetan, you mentioned this move that I think is very important in Zizek's whole oeuvre, that he goes from desire to drive again, whereas it seems like in, absolute recoil and less than nothing, the drive was seen as maybe some kind of relinquishing emancipation from desire. That's certainly the way Hegel talks about his own philosophy, as a circling of circles that continuously loses and finds itself for the sake of its enjoyment, which is ultimately what spirit does. Yes, of course, like Hegel says in Encyclopedic Logic, the goal of philosophy is reconciliation, and the means by which spirit enacts this is enjoyment. Now, if we read this in the Lacanian sense of jouissance, it becomes apparent to us that the process of subjective destitution can be full of enjoyment, but not in a terrific way, but like a terrifying kind of way. And this is also how we have to read this type of enjoyment of the drive, right? Like, let's say some kind of masochist. So yeah, then emerges the question, okay, but what about desire in this case? And encountering the real your desire could also inaugurate subjective destitution. Yet either are, of course, not, perhaps from the vantage point from each, the other seen as a potential solution, which is ultimately illusory. And then all that we are left with is basically the parallax between drive from the vantage point of desire and between desire and the vantage point to drive. So yeah, whether that applies to your example of Gandhi, I'm not sure if these concepts can really illuminate something there. Perhaps it's more there's more to be said in these examples about speech and language itself, not necessarily these processes of compulsion, repetition, which of course is related to the drive, for example. So I guess in that sense, it maybe is more on the side of desire, what you said about, Gandhi's desire for non-violence or whatever.
I'm also taking like on this idea, like you were saying with the narcissist, with the ideal ego. It's almost like if we go back, like we're taking on this kind of warrior idea, like if indeed you're engaging in warrior activities or fighting to maintain your ego, your ideal ego, that's very problematic. Or if you're defining like the fight in terms of I'm a really good employee for the corporation, then it's part of the issue, like you're part of the problem, right? But then there's the fighting your need to be seen and appreciated by other people in a way that like makes you enslaved to them, where you're fighting for what you believe in, like you're fighting for the thing you take a stand on. And it's just very interesting that it does seem like to be a fighter in this sense, I'm always taken, like when Jesus says like be wise as serpents, that's such a weird phrase. Like wise as serpents, what does that mean? In one way, it's like know how the serpent thinks, but also like have this kind of operation. Like you really do have to be wise and also fighting, because you got to make sure that let's put it this way. If Ivan Illich is correct, like all virtues in the wrong system become vices. But that means you have to like discern the right system or the right way to kind of fight for it. And it's interesting that just goes to show maybe today, especially just in this historic epoch, and then I'll pass it to Chicha. I just want to note, maybe today, especially wisdom and the warrior archetype in the way we're describing, especially have to go together. Whereas in the past, in a non-first world nation, maybe not so much, I'm not sure. Whereas today, you really have to also put wisdom part of it, because like, people are going to use virtues to trick you. Like people who have like, there are a lot of people who are actually like working really hard, but they're doing like, I just keep looking at the poor people in China. Like, look at these poor people in China that spent their life retiring, saving. They worked really hard. The government has screwed them. Like they've lost everything now, right? Like they did the virtuous thing and they were screwed over, right? Like, so you got to make sure like that you have the wisdom to make sure that you're fighting in the right way. But then that's so difficult. You're like, I don't want to think about that. So I'll just roll over and give up. Well, that seems to be a temptation as well. Or you just focus on your narcissistic image. So these are thoughts kind of just as they were coming to mind. And I appreciated what you said.
As how it relates to love. And there's similar to you, Daniel proposes the ego ideal as some kind of solution to the narcissism of ideal ego, even though we will never get rid of narcissism. Like there's two types of narcissism for Lacan and Zizek too. There's the primary narcissism, which we will never get rid of, and secondary narcissism. And there's also a book called The Culture of Narcissism, and this is the type of narcissism that we can, as subjects, we work through by means of having symbolic coordinations and narcissism.
I appreciate that comment. I'll give it to Chichan. And Ethan, not to put you on the spot, I would be curious some of the thoughts you may have had since after yesterday on this question of this balance between kind of the warrior, but also not. I am breaking up like crazy, but I'll pass it to Chichan. Chichan, please. Okay, I'm not dead anymore. I'm going to give it out to Chichan. And then, like I said, Chichan and then Ethan, I'd be curious if you have anything, not to put you on the spot. You're such a beautiful soul. So, but Chichan, please.
I think multiple things to be said here. Maybe first thing, if you can think about how narcissism actually stands against this image of the warrior we've been discussing about in some senses, because at some level, if you think about it, there is, this relationship with ideal ego and ego ideal is an interesting one, because ego ideal is something that activates itself in the symbolic realm. It's something that activates itself through some work, and ideal ego always rests on the side of some kind of primary identification that gives you certain kind of unified way of functioning as a body, and so on and so forth. In that sense, it's an identification of the specular image, as Lacan would call it, whereas ego ideal is an identification with the big other. That's how that L schema gets formed, if I remember correctly, of the top of my head. But given this structure in that sense, I've been sort of thinking about this problem of primary identification for quite some time, because I've been thinking about questions of aesthetics in politics, in that sense. And I've been trying to think about this problem, that at what level our identification with an image actually constitutes the question of politics. I'm not saying I have any answer to this problem, but I'm just sort of taking this long route out to say something about violence, actually. That if you think about it, politics more and more today, at least our governmentality more and more today, is functioning through certain modes of aesthetic codes. So, state would try and look at a slum in a particular way, and a formal a society in a particular way. Even the society can be as illegal as the slum is. They both are informal structures. Society can also be illegally made. Slum can be also illegally made. But there are certain aesthetic codes through which state has started sort of operating in that lens. And if you think about it, these aesthetic codes actually function at the level of ideal ego. They are a certain trappings of the ideal ego. They are not functioning in the symbolic realm anymore. So Foucault's idea of power functioning through rationality actually has sort of shifted to power functioning through certain aesthetic. What is the nature of identification that is used in these aesthetic sensibility? And if you ask that question honestly, the nature of identification is this question of specular image, these questions of some form of primary identification in that ideal ego, in that sense. How do we understand that problem? Given this, we can also see that state is able to operationalize various kinds of violence based upon aesthetics. Today's violence is not operationalized based upon rationality and so on and so forth. Today's violence is operationalized, something. If you look at even Israel-Palestine, you forget the complex history behind them and everything. If you notice, people's alignment with even geopolitical alignments today are happening from the perspective of how Israel looks and how Palestine looks. There's a question of appearance which is dominating this whole sphere, which is fascinating, which we don't understand till now. That now things are falling upon appearance. Things are no longer even functioning through, any kind of, in that sense, a rational order in that. Of course, there are geopolitical calculations at play. Hamas aligning with China and so on and so forth, and those discussions aside. But there is certainly a play of appearances that is playing in our times, which has a certain relationship with violence, which we don't understand yet pretty well. I think that's one of the first things which I think we should think about, deliberate upon. Which I just presented a couple of days back in a seminar, this question of aesthetics, and we've been thinking about this aesthetics and violence problem that is shaping up in our times. The other, I think, is this problem of I think thinking about violence as we've been thinking about through this question of absence of violence and non-violence. I think we're confusing both of things together. Violence and non-violence are not the same thing. I think we had a discussion before in that sense that non-violence is not simply absence of violence. Non-violence is a commitment towards coming back to speech whenever you get a chance to, in some senses. Isn't it? Even when you're entering into great forms of war, you can come back to speech. You are always open to coming back to the realm of speech, the realm of politics. You are always giving that. That is the point of non-violence. I think Paul Ricoeur has a great paper. He asked this question: how can a soldier going to a war can be non-violent? And it's a great question to ask. What is the non-violent way to be in a war, basically? I think that's the kind of framing we need for that question. On the other hand, this question of absence of violence, this question of neutralizing all violence is a way of neutralizing all meaning also. Because we don't realize it, violence also activates language. It does destroy language, but at various points, it also activates language. That is how we can come back to speech. Else we would, if we go to the realm of violence, we'll never be able to come back. Why are we able to come back? Because violence with sufficient destruction activates speech back. It activates a way back to speech. It's not simply something that completely destroys speech in that sense. And it is in that point we need to think about this question of non-violence in some senses, in contrast to something like absence of violence, which is quite silly, and we do see those tendencies in our times where people want to kill all violence almost. They want to exist in a world where violence doesn't exist, which is stupid. And then they end up inhabiting the space of violence in the most violent ways. They can do violence without actually any inner, resistances or blockage towards it, which is extremely interesting.
I'll give it to Ethan Nelson because I'd love to hear his thoughts from yesterday afterwards. And it looks like my internet's unstable. So if I vanish, I'm really sorry. And then I'll give it to Tyler Murphy. I'm really taken also. So then it's almost like the nonviolent warrior in the sense where that's not the same as the absence of violence. It's almost like what happens, because what you were saying on aesthetics being power today, that makes me think of the Distinctions book, where it worked on social organization. If you see a guy wearing a top hat 200 years ago and he was dressed a certain way, just the seeing of him said, oh, he's rich. Oh, he has that certain positioning. So aesthetics has a social organizing structure. And likewise, if you say, oh, that place looks run down, well, they deserve what happens to them then. So like power then gets, like, if it looks poor, the aesthetics then function where you go, oh, well, then they can be treated a certain way as opposed to they're irrational. And it's very, like Foucault says, so it's very interesting to think of aesthetics being a movement of power in that way. And then it's almost like, I wonder this, it's almost like if you have the absence of violence, that leads to the absence of speech, which then means everything is organized by aesthetics you can't speak against, and so power wins. Because when you're talking about the absence of violence, I'm thinking about Ivan Illich's disablement. And he says we live in an age where everyone is disabled. You're not capable of doing anything. That's how the system works. It's far more interesting than Orwell or Huxley, in my opinion. Because like in Ivan Illich, you don't need fear. You're not capable of doing anything because you're so dependent on conveniences and whatever. You don't need pleasure to control people. They literally beg for the system to solve their problems for them because they can't solve their own problems. And so Ivan Illich as an alternative to Orwell and Huxley for me is extremely appealing. And in that state of disablement, which is trying to make a world absent of violence, then people aren't capable of the non-violence that would allow the possibility of speech and then power, to stand against power. Therefore, then aesthetics, the image has full reign. It controls everything at that point because we're trying to be an absence of violence society as opposed to a non-violent society. And that's a very interesting distinction. And I'll give it to Ethan. But it's interesting to think of like a non-violent warrior in that sense. But actually, that's not the inability to do violence, but the ability to hold it in suspension in a way, or hold it within. It also makes me think of the difference maybe between a Western conception of the warrior and an Eastern conception of some versions of the warrior. I was thinking about that as well. But let me give it to Ethan Nelson because I'm going to put you on the spot, Ethan. It's good to see you, sir. What have you been thinking about since yesterday? And then I'll give it to Tyler Murphy. Ethan.
Yeah, so nice to be here, resonating a lot with what was just being said. I was actually just sitting with sharing the topic of violence, the topic of how does a warrior show up. I was sitting with the Bhagavad Gita, and then it says one of the lessons in that I took away from it is essentially like being afraid of going to war and not engaging in war because of fear is not the same thing as the virtue of nonviolence, right? And it's like knowing that I could that I have the capacity to do something if I want to, and choosing not to is not the same thing as feeling incapable and afraid of something. And so therefore, basically what I took from that is that, like, it's not necessarily good or virtuous to not do a bad thing out of fear, but actually the good thing is to know that you could do the bad thing and not doing it, and like having that capability there. And so yeah, that comes up in a lot of different situations. Like, I think the topic of having capacity to do something is super fundamental here. And yeah, I was sitting with a lot of what was being said, and yeah, I mean, there's just like a lot of jumbled thoughts happening, and I'm like struggling to string together a coherent thing. But I was noticing in the topic of um, language being destructive, or like once someone puts something out, I was relating to that from the perspective of the warrior as like, if someone puts out something, I now have to respond to that thing. And I notice in myself, when I feel the least courageous is when I just kind of give into that, when I just like want to not upset someone, but actually being able to like yeah, I was struggling with the ego ideal concept, because like for me it feels like it's not in service of narcissism. If I'm gonna like stand up against something, it's not necessarily in service of narcissism as much as it is in service of virtue. Like being able to be disagreeable to something that feels wrong feels more virtuous than narcissistic to me, in the sense of yeah, it's like we spoke on this, OG Rose, the other day, on the topic of virtue, of like, if I'm going to spend time cultivating certain capacities in myself, such as, you know, reflecting on my motives and sitting and writing, or like sitting and reading something that's difficult, I'm gonna have to say no to people. I'm gonna get invited out to do things, and I'm gonna have to be like, hey, I would love to, but not gonna happen. And if it upsets them, it upsets them. If they get mad at me and think I'm just being a hermit and they don't like it, like, so be it. But it's just like, that is what I have to stand up for. And it does, yeah, it feels like almost virtuous to do that. And yeah, on the topic of what we were speaking about in Cadella's community yesterday, feels really, I haven't got any resolution on it, but it just feels like a good dialectic to just sit with and gestate on. This dialectic of, if I cultivate warrior virtues such as courage, discipline, mastery, is it worth it if in the end of the day I'm still being co-opted by the system and nothing actually changes? Like, is it still worth it to stand up in that way of being, even if it has no impact at the end of the day and it was all meaningless and nothing ends up changing? I'm not exactly sure, but my gut instinct is that there is still a reason to stand up for virtue and to stand up for this way of being in the world, despite if I'm still being co-opted by larger systems. I can do my best to not play into those power games and to understand those power games and to be able to do my best to not be manipulated by them. But if I'm, as a result of living in a society, being co-opted in some way, shape, or form, which is out of my control, still feels virtuous to me to show up with courage and discipline and loyalty and service to others and whatever virtues we may want to cultivate.
Lovely comment, Ethan Nelson. I'm going to give it to Tyler Murphy and Dimitri. And I think part of the issue is that one of the reasons why there's some sort of mentality of fighting that's necessary is the acts that are not narcissistic from another perspective are called narcissistic. And you have to know it's not narcissistic. And that's what's tricky. Like, that's what's so tricky. Everything, like following Hegel, can have a doubleness. Everything can be seen from another perspective as being a vice. Like, virtues are virtues because they could be interpreted as vices. Like, if everyone agrees that that's good to do, that actually takes away from the virtue of it as opposed to the groupthink of it. And that's what's so hard about this, is that the same action in one context is a virtuous act, but the same act in another context is a vice act potentially. And that's where the discernment, the wisdom of serpents and all of that is so important. On the idea of the system, I'll just add quickly. I think I think Dagny Taggart in Atlas Shrugged is a great example of someone fighting for someone who's unintentionally contributing to the system that Ayn Rand talks about in Atlas Shrugged. That's actually a relevant book here. Now, I think we have to go through all, going through the philosophy of objectivism is a different matter, but the ways he describes the breakdown of the supply chains in the ways that someone can be doing something virtuous, but because it's maintaining a poisonous system, it's actually problematic. So you have to make sure your virtue is being plugged into the right thing. But that, of course, what? Discernment. And the hope would be that the social contract was in place, or that the society was in place where you wouldn't have to do that. But in a world today where that's not so given, as we talk about in Belonging Again, there is this added layer of awareness of where you're directing your virtue, right? Because you may unintentionally, what Ayn Rand in that book talks about is unintentionally contributing to the looters, even though she's doing the right thing. But because he's not willing to let something fail, it becomes a parasitical kind of relationship. So that's an interesting book. And I spoke with Bethany and Jacob on that not too long ago. Now we'd have to go through the whole, another example, the example I would give here, and we were talking to Voicecraft about this, and I'll give it to Tyler. Like, let's take the situation in Israel and Gaza right now, right? So I feel like I have no idea what to think, right? Because I'm not there. I don't know. So here's the question. Is that humility or apathy? Am I being humble to say I don't know what's going on? Or am I just saying that because I'm actually apathetic and don't even want to think about it, right? So some people may say, oh, Daniel, it's because you're apathetic and don't care about the suffering of other people. But there's also something really arrogant to think that you, as not being a world specialist on Middle Eastern affairs or knowing the deep history between all those nations, would have anything of any perspective to say other than very trite positions of it's wrong to kill. It's wrong what Hamas did. You could say that, but then it's like, okay, maybe it would be better for you not to say anything, because the whole reason you're saying that is because you want your neighbor to think you're a good person, right? You don't want to be seen as not saying something about the Middle East, and that's why you're saying something. You don't actually care, but you're going to show that you care so that you don't have to worry about your neighbor thinking you're a bad person, right? This is an example of why you kind of need a warrior mentality in some perspective, because you have to say, no, my motives are humility. I've done the work to go through to see if it's self-deception. I'm not closed to being involved if it would be needed, but I also know that I'm not involved in the Israeli intelligence service, so I don't know, but other people may accuse you of being apathetic and not caring, right? There's some sort of like fighting for what your motives actually are that is required there, or you're going to be awake at night going, I don't know, maybe I am apathetic. Maybe I could be doing more. I don't know. And now you're swept up in some political movement and, mass movement, or you then you unplug entirely, right? So it's just kind of interesting because even in a Paul Virilio world where everyone's connected and you see all the images, you're actually constantly put in situations where people know that you know about the Israeli-Gaza situation, and they know you haven't put a tweet out about it or said anything about it, and they're mad at you for doing it, but you're not doing it from a place of humility, but they're now mad at you. Are you able to stand against that social pressure? So from that standpoint, this is a very live tension that you always have to live with in some respects. So I've been thinking a lot about that, but I'll pass it to Tyler Murphy and then Dimitri.
Earlier when Chetan was talking, just this quote that Peter Rollins often comes back to. I think he is quoting some comedian where he talks about that. I think he says that war is not conflict, but war is the inability to have conflict. And so I don't know, just, yeah, this is, I guess I'm trying to think. I've been thinking through the last day or two about forgiveness and, in the Lord's Prayer, and how do we actually come to forgive? And I guess I'm curious your guys' thoughts on if we throw forgiveness into this conversation. How do we learn how to forgive? what's necessary. I would argue that I think psychoanalytic theory and philosophy is necessary, so because in studying that you kind of learn about like other people's idiosyncrasies and the necessity of that, and how your idiosyncrasy is going to drive somebody else nuts, and it's going to drive yourself nuts. And partly, how do we learn how to create a harbor for the other person's jouissance, idiosyncrasies, all that kind of stuff, and sit in the conflict instead of going, the hell with it, storming out, abandoning it, or taking a gun and just saying, I'm ending this now. So yeah, just I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on forgiveness and grace and loving mercy, all that kind of stuff.
Our favorite thing to do at the net is to throw as many big topics together at once, stir it up, and see what happens. So thank you for contributing. So that is great, because forgiveness is huge. And I also wanted to say, Ethan, I appreciate you sitting in the dialectic of that tension and thinking it through, because I think it, like you were just saying, between system enabling, and I think there's nobility in the fight, because I think because we're alive right now, and I don't think it's meaningless. And I'll add to that, but the point I wanted to say on the forgiveness, I will definitely say that the world right now is in massive trouble because it cannot coherently arrive at a distinction between forgiveness and enabling evil. Like, aren't you kind of enabling evil if you forgive those people? And, in Christianity, it's like, well, get on your cross and die. So there's like a metaphysical doctrine. Also, importantly, in the great book, Exclusion and Embrace by Mikol Wolf, who's a very good theologian, he notes that the only way they were able to bring peace in the Balkans is once he started telling all the tribes, hey, by the way, there's actually a hell that the people who are evil will go to, so you don't need to take violence into your own hands. The doctrine of hell actually contributed to peace, precisely because it could stop the tribal warfare, because you're like, okay, well, only God can judge, and evil is punished, so I don't need to do it myself. My business is to forgive. It's kind of interesting. I think that book's fascinating because you don't tend to think of like an idea of hell as contributing to forgiveness and the ability to forgive. But what it does is remove justice from people's like concern, because what we have right now is a massive problem of not really knowing the difference between enabling evil and forgiving evil. And that goes to everything I was saying too, like your neighbors, like you're enabling evil, you're forgiving them, you call it forgiveness, I call it enablement, and you got to stand by it. That's an example of where a kind of very difficult fighter spirit is. But how do you yourself even know the difference if you haven't done the philosophy and the thinking and the wisdom, right? So you have to engage in that wisdom to even know where to stand, right? And there's always the risk that you're standing for the wrong thing, but that's precisely where there's the possibility of the virtue, because there can be no courage where there's no possibility of mistake, right? So all of these things seem to come together to define the state that we have today with the loss of sociological givens. And let me give it to Mr. Dimitri. Bye, Mr. Luber. I'm going to make you cry when you listen to the harmonica. I promise. Dimitri, please.
Yeah, what you just said, Daniel and Tyler, that's in a nutshell, it's super similar to how I've been thinking this during this conflict. I remember when this shit hit the fan, I was just like, I don't know what's happening. And then I saw all these people in my feed. Some you were pro Palestine, pro Israel, lots of vicious things, imagery, and I it's really like Daniel, you described it perfect. You acted it out perfectly. This kind of like panic that went through people who are so fixated on that image. So, like, I don't know. I have to choose in the tragedy. Like this is what philosophy is about. Retract and withdraw into the space of unknowing and reconcile with it. Like, let it be there. And it's really only in this way that we, by that distancing from all that immediacy of the image and of your body and feelings, that you can start to think forgiveness and reconciliation. And I think I completely agree with what Zizek says in his article, that there's this view that all of Israel is basically evil. And then there's also the view that all of Palestine is basically evil. The people who say from the river to the sea, it has to be Palestine. And then there's also, people on the other side who are completely, against Jews. So this is actually a stance that fuels both extremist positions. Like this stance, like if you see Palestinians only by seeing Hamas, or if you see Israel and this entire population through the lens of what it is through like its current far-right government, that's really not from where you can forgive. Like that would be, I think, like this kind of enabling of evil would be conditioned there. So it's in a sense, the good news, and the situation is very tragic, is that there is, Palestinians aren't reducible to Hamas, and Israelis are not reducible to Netanyahu, it's the evil government, and also even the colonial structures that the state has inbuilt into it. So Zizek's article basically was about, for those who can see mutual reconciliation as a possibility through forgiveness, that's where the possibility for peace starts. And in this conflict, there is no military solution, not a viable humanitarian one anyway. So this is actually it's related to. I was thinking this conflict made me think about the Yugoslav wars, and when Zizek talks about the Yugoslav wars and the ethnic conflict there, and he talks about how before the wars and the ethnic cleansings, there would be this amicable humor between the Serbs and the Croats and the Bosnians, and everyone would say that Bosnians are stupid, and then the Bosnians would have something else to say about how the Serbians are whatever, and these stereotypes would just flow through the symbolic, and people would laugh and joke about it. And I see it as very similar as the relationship between the Netherlands and Belgium, because in Dutch jokes, Belgians are always stupid. That's the joke is always on the Belgians, and this is a kind of amicable joke, but it's like, for some weird reason, the way the symbolic order works is that this can, in a sense, the jokes escalate to the extent to which people go through war for these kinds of notions. And, this also has a relationship to poetry. For example, Milosevic and Karadzic were both poets. And the way they were talking about the nation state also has something to do with that. That's Zizek's argument anyhow. So it's, there's an immense amount of anger and hate and bitterness from Palestinians to Israelis and vice versa, which is understandable. And these are, on the one hand, subjective kind of categories. I'm not describing social categories here. And the problem is, of course, a social kind of conflict. Now, through the catharsis of laughter, you can basically go from like war to conflict. Like when you're great friends, you can just take the piss out of each other, and that's the way it's sublimated. It seems that state is very far from the situation we are in right now. But then again, forgiveness and reconciliation are based on the breaking of the law itself. So it is not within moral law that we can justify this forgiveness. As Hegel will emphasize, it's a breaking of convention. Love is, and reconciliation is, and forgiveness is. So that's why it's seen as evil, right? Because it's not lawful. It doesn't uphold law, does not submit to law. It's groundless in that sense too. So yeah, that's that's important as well, because this event that will maybe take place, some kind of reconciliatory event in the future, is a possibility. We must not rule it out. Yet we cannot see it structurally develop to that place, since moral law is basically followed up till that point. Yeah. Oh, and actually, I wanted to say something else. So, oh, Ethan isn't here anymore. Okay, well, I was gonna say that the paranoiac loves to accuse the other, and also loves to, kind of negate himself. Love is a strong word. It's quite visceral what occurs. And this, for Freud, happens in three kinds of ways, these fundamental negations. Like, one of them is jealousy, which is, of course, very vicious. One of them is, strangely enough, erotomania, which is, from what I know, basically the delusional belief that someone's really into you sexually or romantically. And then the third one is, funnily enough, interpretation, as broad of a term that it is. So the paranoiac basically is this kind of delusion that he casts out on the world. Like, he casts out his misanthropy on the world, his hatred of other humans, for his own disorder. Because, of course, he does not know that actually this disorder constitutes his being. It's his own responsibility. Yet this is the way he copes with it.
No, I appreciate all that, Dimitri. I thank you very much. And it makes me think, so as we've been saying that the break in language has a revelation, we also, this kind of telepathy between twins. I'm now wondering about the transformation of a joke through time. Like, jokes at one time are funny, but then it becomes an insult. Now it's almost like a war is a joke taken too far. Like with Yemen, you get like.
I mean, I was like saying that, but the thing is, it sounds so ridiculous.
Yes, I know, but that's the weird thing. Yeah. It's ridiculous that twins have telepathy. Like, it's ridiculous that we understand language when it's not complete. There's like ridiculousness in the very human experience of how things blossom into something else. Like, that you can make when someone, like, you're crying at a concert where people are making jazz noises. Like isn't that weird? Like, why? Like, and it's like, why not Celine Dion's "My Heart Will Go On," right? There's more beautiful lyrics. And yet there's something about the human subject that creates the possibilities of these ridiculous realities that are hints of what the real is. And that very real then suggests what the human has to be prepared for if they're not going to be self-effaced or they're going to live well. I do feel I'll have to run, but as a final thought, I'm also taken by that language of the realm of unknowing. And philosophy is about, so is it something where you have the realm of violence and you have the realm of unknowing, and the only way to deal with violence is to bring the realm of violence into the realm of unknowing and keep it there? And like, that's what we have to do. And then I'm wondering too, if violence has something to do with determination, like in the Hegelian sense, like something is determined and determined. Well, that's not potentiality. Oh, that's a bookcase. The determinants is bookcase, right? Oh, they asked me to go to the movies. I know they're going to find out if I say yes or no. There's a determinate reality that will manifest, and I'm going to be forced to live with it. And that's kind of the violence, in a way, is the necessary manifestation, the necessary determination. Whereas the realm of the unknowing is potentiality that is not manifest. And because it's in that unknowing, you can avoid the violence because nothing has to necessarily be determined, right? Because you don't know what you should do regarding the war, right? So you don't act. But it's not a absence of action, it's a non-action, like the difference between the absence of violence and non-violence, right? Like the philosopher is engaging in non-action precisely to keep the violence in the unknowing, because there's no other way to deal with it. In the same way that if you say, like with McCall Wolf is talking about, like if you say only God can judge, you're basically saying, I don't know what's right and wrong. I'm going to let God judge it at the divine, at the judgment day or whatever, right? And if you don't have that, then you get all these kind of problems that kind of emerge. If you don't have, it's almost like if you have no possibility of putting violence in the realm of unknowing, then there's no way to determine the difference between forgiveness and enabling evil. And then you have all of the pathologies and nervousness that comes with that. And so the philosophical act, in this sense, is an act of non-action to move the determinate into unknowing, out of the realm of violence, of which then the only response to it would be further violence. And then you get the cycles and the cycles and the cycles. Well, if we've lost religion in one sense, then we don't have like a metaphysical realm that's so easily through mythos to move violence into unknowability. And now it's more like the act of a subject that has to be trained to do it, which would be this act of philosophical non-action. And so it's like the non-violent warrior engaged in non-action to maintain the humility of unknowing, precisely to stay out of the realm of violence that once in, then it's all violence. It's all just kind of there. That's all live. I'll give it to Tyler Murphy and then run. But I'm curious, like realm, I'm really like that phrase, the realm of unknowability, and I'm contrasting it with the realm of violence and the bringing of things into unknowability. It's almost like the choice is unknowability or violence. Like that's what it comes down to. You have to choose between that, engage in non-action to keep things in unknowability. But
unknowability thing connects to questions of uncertainty. Certainty, uncertainty. We can go back to Descartes and think for that question from there. Then what is it about to have the certainty in that sense? How do we pick the uncertainty?
Oh, I think certainty has a violence to it, and I think we destroy the world in our quest for certainty, as opposed to what like Newbegin calls proper confidence. Like we weren't satisfied with confidence in Eden, so we went for the forbidden fruit of certainty and ended up in not so great. So it's almost like we could have had confidence; it was pretty great, but we had to have that certainty, and that caused all sorts of issues in there. But I love that. You guys are magic.